Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this week we're going to be talking about PostgreSQL. It's kind of a hard one to say. A lot of people just end up saying Postgres, which is probably what I'll end up doing as well. So what is Postgres? It's a database server, and a pretty cool one at that. So as I go through stuff here, we're going to cover Postgres a little bit more generically, and then we'll look at how you might use it with Xojo. I want to remind everyone that feel free to ask questions at any point while I'm talking. I can see them on my other screen. I'll address them when I get a chance. So let's see here. I have a tab open. This here's the download page for Postgres. The current version is 9.3. And that's the version I'm running right here on OS 10. The cool thing about Postgres is it's fully cross-platform, so you can install it on OS 10, Windows, or Linux. And the even cooler thing about it, is that it is free, completely free. Free as in you don't have to pay for it, and free as in no licensing restrictions around its use. You can grab it and use it for whatever you want. That makes it a very good choice for a lot of apps. And it's also a very robust database. So in addition to being free, it's also a pretty quality database, and there's no reason not to use it for that reason. It's also integrated into Xojo if you have the database access license. Included is a Postgres plugin that allows you to directly connect to Postgres databases. And of course, that means you can use Postgres with web, desktop, or console applications. Now, I'm going to click right here on the OS 10 page. One cool thing, if you happen to be running OS 10, and I didn't see this the last time I was checking out Postgres, but there's this new thing called Postgres.app. And it's pretty much a one-click way to get Postgres up and running on your OS 10 system. You download this thing, you unzip it, you copy it to your applications folder, you double-click it, and you have a Postgres server that's up and running on your computer in a little menu bar icon associated with it, which is pretty cool. It tells you the port it's running on, creates a default user that matches whatever your user account name is. And this is what we're going to use for testing here, because this is nice, fast, and easy, and you just quit it to stop the Postgres server from running, which might make sense, because if you're doing development, a lot of development, and you want to work on Postgres, you may want to install a Postgres database server on your main computer. But I mean, these things take resources and overhead, so you may not want to install it on your main computer, or you may want to start and stop it when you need it. And this appears to make that very, very easy to work with. And of course, you can grab full downloads from the page if you want to install it on a real server, and there are versions for the other operating systems as well. Now, some of the things that Postgres has, because it's a database server, and all database servers generally have these things, but if you've primarily worked with SQLite, you may not be too familiar with them, is the concept of users and roles. So with Postgres, you actually have to connect to the database by specifying a username and a password, and give it the actual name of the database, because a Postgres database server can actually host multiple databases. You can run store procedures on Postgres databases, much like you can with most other database servers. And I believe with Postgres, they can be written in a variety of languages. I don't recall them all off the top of my head, but a neat thing about store procedures, it allows you to have code that runs on the database server rather on the client system, which can be valuable depending on the design of your application. Some people really hate them, some people swear by them, but either way, it's nice to have them there in case you need them. You can, of course, do full backups and restores of your Postgres databases. And generally, I find that Postgres has syntax that's very similar to Oracle. So if you're familiar at all with Oracle, Postgres might be more comfortable for you. So I'm going to switch here to a little admin tool. This is the free admin tool that's included with Postgres. Although if you install this Postgres app thing, you do have to download this this thing separately. Let me put up the URL for that. You can just grab it here. Again, this is available for different platforms. It's a nice little tool, not terribly friendly looking, and it can be a little obtuse at times, but gives you full access to Postgres and everything. So it's pretty much a necessity to start with. And of course, there's lots of places and companies that make other tools that can be used to administer Postgres and its databases. But we'll look at this one for now, and then I'll show you a list later on the Postgres wiki of a variety of other ones that are available. All right, so if you have this running and you get Postgres running, the first thing you would generally do is you click the connect button and tell it to connect to the server. You would just give it a name. The local host would be the one you're running on your computer, and then you'd give it whatever the username is of your account. In this particular case, I'm running on an account called Webinar. Surprise, surprise. So that's the username for this account. And the Postgres app doesn't actually specify a password since you intend to be running it locally. Certainly don't do that if you put this anywhere that's publicly accessible. And that added my little server here, which you can see by default would appear like that. And you can just expand it, and you can see that already it comes pre-installed with 2 databases. The Postgres app created a database matching the username, and there's always the admin database that's on here, the Postgres database. And then you can see, you can expand these things and start to see all kinds of crazy things that are available with these full-blown database servers. But the most important thing we'll be looking at here is the list of the tables, of which there are none at the moment. And the login roles you'll see here, you can have multiple login roles created so that different people can log in with different usernames and passwords and that sort of thing. And by default, it has the one that was created by the Postgres app. Now you can have multiple databases in addition to what's built here. So you can actually create a new database. And now we have a new database here that I can click on and see all the same stuff. And I can actually fill it with some information. So I'm going to load it up here. Just going to open up this so I can copy the text. All right, if you watch the SQLite webinar, there's a website that has a Chinook sample database for a variety of database systems. And I grabbed the one for Postgres, and this is a script to create a bunch of tables and populate the tables with data. So I'm just going to run the script here, and it's going to run all those commands one after another. You can see here it's running, and it ran very quickly. And that is using the little query builder. So I could, of course, just write my own SQL queries here, which we might do later. But we can come back to the Chinook database that we see here. We can expand the schema, public schema. And we can see now there's a bunch of tables here. And you can keep expanding the hierarchy to see things. All the lists of the tables, you can expand. Oh, when we're getting a helpful tip, I haven't turned off the tips on this little tool here. Let's bring this window up here. And we could optimize the database, and it's recommending we do that because apparently that's a lot of empty spots or something. Don't really need to worry about that now, I suppose. But you expand the table, and you can see the columns that are on it, any other constraints it has, what the primary key is, what the foreign keys are, what they're related to. So this particular, we'll expand that. This foreign key maps to the artist table. And you can, I imagine you can click on it and see more information about it here, see which column it pertains to. So essentially this is saying that this artist ID column is a foreign key back to the artist table. Handy information. And you can see the indexes. You can right click on a table and you can view the data in its own little window. Looks like I can double click in here and edit the data if I wanted. So all pretty handy, typical administration type stuff that you can do with your databases. Let's see, Terry is asking if you're more familiar with Microsoft SQL Server. How different is it coming to PostgreSQL? Probably the biggest difference I see when coming to Postgres from other databases is how primary keys are handled. Most other databases will have some sort of type that allows you to have an auto-incrementing primary key. But Postgres and Oracle, for that matter, do not. They use something called a sequence, which is a different database object that is responsible for creating unique incrementing values. So dealing with the sequences and how they're used to populate your primary keys is probably the biggest change when moving to a database like Postgres, if you're coming from something like Microsoft SQL Server or even MySQL, or SQLite for that matter. Other than that, I mean, the SQL itself is largely going to be the same. I mean, there's always little differences in certain syntax, but overall they're primarily the same. The concepts of users and all these permissions and multiple databases on the server and whatnot are the same across the database servers. So you won't find any of that new or difficult to deal with. And Terry follows that up with another question of, can you control where the databases are stored on the drives? I do not know. I'm sure that's a configuration setting somewhere. I don't believe the PG admin has a way to specify that, but I'm sure if you're installing the full version of Postgres, there's plenty of configuration files that will allow you to control that stuff. Postgres has gotten a lot easier more recently. I mean, back in the day, like 5 years ago or more, getting Postgres up and running was pretty tricky and not something the average person would be comfortable doing. But nowadays, it's pretty easy to set up. They've automated a lot of the stuff that you used to have to tweak by hand. And this new Postgres app thing is pretty much the ultimate inconvenience for local database development anyway. All right, let me just go over here. I'm reviewing my notes. All right, we're in the Chinook database at the moment. Now, one thing you can do, pretty much with any of these database servers, but here you can do backups and restores of databases. So I can take a backup of this database and we'll save that to the desktop. And get Finder window going here. Oh, I need to probably click the backup button first. There we go. Since it didn't appear in my Finder window, it made me realize I forgot to do that. So you see here, it backed up the database. So if I drag the little window over, you can see we now have a backup file here on the desktop that's relatively concise. It's only 163K. The actual SQL file, being a large text file, was much bigger, almost 2 megabytes. So it shrunk it down nicely. And now you have a backup file that you could use to restore and get the contents back immediately into a different Postgres server, back into this one if you needed to, for some reason, if it got corrupted or whatnot. And actually, I haven't looked into this yet, but I'm certain that there's some built-in capability of this Postgres system to automate these backups so that they can be run on schedules and stuff like that. Now, to use Postgres with Xojo, you need to have the Postgres plugin in your plugins folder. It's in there by default, so you shouldn't really have to copy it over there. But if you do have to copy it there because you removed it for some reason, you will have to restart Xojo in order for it to reload the plugin. But once the plugin is in place and you're using Xojo, you have access to some classes. And in particular, the PostgreSQL database class. So let's take a look at a simple example here. All right, this little example is going to connect to a Postgres database. It's going to create a table in the database we connect to, add some data to the table, and then just select the data and display it in a list box. So we can see how some of these commands work. Now, by and large, this is going to work almost exactly how you would connect to any database using Xojo. It's some of the little details for how you create the table, dealing with the sequences are different that we'll see. But by and large, it's pretty much the same as how you would connect to any database. So let's just run this so you can see what it actually does. Actually, before we do that, we're going to look at the connect button code so you can see here just how it's connecting initially. I did have to put in the username and the database of webinar that were created by the Postgres app that I installed. So I click the button, it says we successfully connected. And I got an error because I ran this test earlier before the webinar started, to make sure everything worked. And I forgot to delete one thing, which was the sequence that was previously created. I did delete the table, but I didn't delete the sequence. So that's a good example of the error handling, but we can come in here and find that object and remove it. So yes, sequence still has a 1 there. And technically I don't need to delete it because it already exists, and the button is just going to recreate both the table and the sequence in one step. But I'll delete them both so we can see it run without errors, hopefully. So you see I'm dropping the table, which is usually the term that you use when you're removing stuff. So now we created the table and the sequence. We can come back here, do a refresh, and we can see the table now appears here. I don't see that. There's the sequence. I had to click. And then I can click to add some sample data. And then I can click the button to show the sample data. And equally, I could come back here and view the data. And hopefully the data would match. And it does. All right. And then the last thing this we'll look at when we look at the code is the use of a prepared statement to actually look up stuff. And you can search for a specific name by typing it in the box. All right, just scanning the question list here. Terry is also asking if we can use the ODBC plugin to connect to Postgres. And yeah, absolutely. As long as you have a Postgres ODBC driver, you can certainly connect to Postgres using ODBC. Probably would be faster to use the built-in plugin, but sometimes ODBC might be preferred. So we already looked at the connection code here, and you see pretty straightforward, like with any connecting to any database in Xojo. You create a new instance of the class that you want. Because this is a server, you actually have to tell it where the server is located. That's the host. In this case, it's located right here running on my Mac Pro, so it's the local host. But if this were a public server, you could give the IP or the name of the server. Then you have to give a username and a password. Generally, you will always have a password. But that needs to be provided to connect. And you also need to provide the name of the database. So when I'm here connected to the webinar database, I can't see the stuff that's in the Chinook database, for example. That's a completely different database, and I'm not connected to that. And then you do the usual connect test, and then check for errors. So that's all pretty straightforward. The next test is the creating of the team table. And that is done right here. And you can see what the syntax looks like. And pretty straightforward. This looks almost exactly like a create table syntax you'd see with any other database. Create table is the command, team is the name of the table, ID, integer, not null, primary key, pretty straightforward stuff. Name as text, coach as text, city as text. Postgres has a wide variety of data types for your columns. Pretty much anything you can think of is on the list. Text can be used to hold text. You often see people use a varchar instead of text, mostly probably for historical reasons, because that's what things were called many years ago. I probably can bring up the whole list of stuff too on the documentation page. Data types right here. So you can see there are quite a few types to choose from for storing information. And unlike SQLite, Postgres is strongly typed. So if you create a column and it's of type integer, you're not going to be able to be storing text in it. That'll raise database error. All right. In this particular case, we're also creating a sequence to track the primary keys. And this is done just with the command you see here, create sequence. You give it a name and you start it at a value. And that creates the sequence object on the database, which will get incremented as you call a method on it, which we'll see in the add rows when we're adding the rows to increment the values there. Let's see, I got a comment here from Fotis that is saying that it could use an alternate syntax called big serial that might generate the keys. I haven't played around with that, so I don't know how that exactly works. That would be cool if it did that. I'm not aware of that particular capability. So this created both the table and the sequence for putting the data in. Now we want to look at the add data code. So we're adding 3 rows. So this actually calls a method to add each row. And it calls the method 3 times. And let's see here. The method does the usual error checking to make sure it's actually connected. And then it's creating a database record and then just populating the values with the parameters that were passed in. The first column, though, is being set with a value from a sequence. And that's calling another method. And this method is just fetching the next sequence value from the sequence. And it just does this using just a regular SQL select into a record set and getting the value. All right, so, and again, this stuff here with the database record, it's pretty straightforward stuff. You do this with any database that you would work with for creating new rows. Set the database record, insert it into the team, and then check for errors. The last part of this example is the show data. Again, checks if it's connected to the database. And then here it has 2 different ways that it's selecting the data from the database. First way is just doing plain SQL if you didn't type anything in the little search box. So it's just saying select star from team. Pretty simple, straightforward SQL statement. And then it's fetching that using the SQL select method and putting it into a record set. Skipping ahead, there's just the usual code here that loops through the record set and populates the list box with the data. The prepared statement is a little more interesting because this allows you to supply a parameter into the SQL, and it allows you to do it using the built-in binding of Postgres rather than doing string concatenation, which can be fairly risky if your server is publicly accessible because you raise the concern of having SQL injection, where people could sneak in other SQL commands to run inside of general user input. And that's never a good thing. So you can see on the prepared statement, the difference here is there's this little placeholder, $1, that is used for the value. And then what you do is you create a new prepared statement from the SQL with the placeholder. And then you bind in the value you want for the placeholder. So in this particular case, the value that we want to search for is the name that was typed in the name field. So we've saved that off here. And then I add to the ends of it the two wildcards for the like command so that it'll find the text anywhere in the string, regardless of whether it starts with it or ends with it. And then it also calls the SQL select command for the prepared statement and then returns its results into a record set that is then just looped through the same as the other record set. So that record set code doesn't have to change, just the initial preparation for the SQL is different. Most of the time, you're probably going to want to be using prepared statements, unless you do have very simple things that the user cannot be modifying. SQL injection is a real concern, particularly for web apps, because those are generally publicly accessible, and you don't want to have that level of exposure. For desktop apps, it's not as big a concern because those are not as accessible, but prepared statements can sometimes provide a bit of a performance boost in that the database server can cache the little bit of parsing it has to do on commands. So if it turns out you're using a similar or the same command repeatedly throughout your application and throughout multiple users of the application, the small amount of time that it takes the Postgres SQL parser to parse that command out and do what it has to do might add up and might result in a little performance boost for your application. All right, let's see here. I got a few comments I'm going to address, so give me a second while I make these bigger so I can see them. All right. Chem is noting that this big serial thing that I hadn't heard of is actually some sort of macro that creates the sequence for you behind the scenes. And that reminds me of a somewhat related thing. This is like when you go to a restaurant and you're happily eating, and the servers come behind you and sing you happy birthday. Today is Chem's birthday, and I'm not going to sing, but I have this little Xojo app that does a dancing cake that I will play here for 30 seconds so that this is recorded forever. Or maybe not 30 seconds because it's not all that exciting. But happy birthday, Chem. All right, let's quit that and go back to the questions. All right, Marcus is asking, what is the difference between a sequence and a primary key? Well, they're both different things. The primary key is a column on a table. A sequence is a value that you would put in a column on the table, and it's just it's a sequential value that is guaranteed to always be unique. So essentially, you declare your table to have a primary key, and you use the sequence to get the unique values to put into the primary key. And Fabian is asking questions about, if you read the key before you save, what's the issue with contention, and that's one of the things that you get that's built into Postgres and Oracle for that matter. These things are all managed by the database. There's no chance of duplicate sequences being handed out. Let's see here. Bind type. On my little example here for the prepared statement, I did not bind the type of the column, which I could have done. And I put a cursor here so I get the right things there. I'm trying to remember where the type definitions are. Must be on post. Yeah, now I don't remember. Anyway, you can specify the type here and pick text or whatever, but Postgres will try to figure these things out, or the plugin will try to figure these things out for you if you don't specify it. And yes, someone is asking, who is that? That's Gerald. The number that's here is just the order of the parameters that you see in your SQL statement. And Joe is asking the usual question of, will these projects be available after? And yes, they will. Actually, most of this Postgres project and the other couple we're going to look at are already in your Xojo examples in the databases folder. But as usual, I tend to make little tweaks and refinements for these webinars, so the newer versions will be available in the next release of Xojo. And Terry is asking if Postgres has a blob type field. Well, that kind of will segue into our next thing we're going to look at. We'll just bring up the data type thing here. There are the binary data types that are probably the equivalent of a blob, sorry. But SQL, sorry, I'm going to say SQLite here. Postgres actually has the ability to put binary objects directly in the database, but not in a table. So let me open up that project. And we'll run this here and punch in our little login information. And we can see, we'll look at the code, of course, but you can see in the log that it created what's called a large object in the database, and it got back an ID for it. And then it wrote a bunch of data to the object, and then it read that data back. This is probably a somewhat unique feature to Postgres. I can't say I've used this with Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server. Doesn't mean they don't exist, though. But create large object is a method that's on the Postgres SQL database class, and it allows you to create this large object in the database itself. It's not directly related to a table in any way. It's just something that lives on the database. Now, you're probably going to want to store the references to it somewhere so you don't lose track of these things, because it returns back the ID. But once you get that, you get the ID, and then you can open these things, and you can get to the right part here. Write out information to it, of course, with all the error handling that's checking to make sure these things work. But it's just writing out a bunch of text to it. But it could be anything. You could be reading in a binary file off the local system and then writing it out into the large object. And then you can get the length of it, and then you can, of course, read the data back in, which could then be saved back to the local file system or whatever. So an interesting thing that you can do here with Postgres, which might prove handy, And yeah, and Terry's asking, how do you correlate these objects to a record? Well, you do that using the object ID that you get back when you create the large object. Right here, it's passed in as a, looks like, if I can figure out here, get the right part. When you create the large object, you get back the object ID. Then this is just a number of some kind. And then once you have that, yeah, it's just probably want to use that be a larger than just an integer, depending on how many you're putting out there, but it's just a number. And then you can store that in a column in a table that you can then reference and then pull up for different particular rows or whatnot of your table. Justin is asking about recommendations for storing large chunks of data in Postgres. Well, like any database, do's and don'ts of that, I would suggest probably in most cases you don't want to put large blobs of data in your database. So of course, everything depends on your design of your app and what you need to be able to do. But I mean, sending that large chunks of data, generally your database is going to not be on your local computer. So you're going to have to send this data over the network. That could be slow, depending on the size of the data. Postgres, I'm sure, is more than capable of handling these giant chunks of data, unlike something like SQLite, which can get bogged down if you stuff all kinds of binary data in the database. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. But this has that capability in there. So I think it would probably work pretty decently if you had a real need to actually put binary data in there. You can have your looping in here. This means you'll be able to thread it. You'll be able to keep your user interface responsive. I mean, these things are full-blown database servers. They're likely to be running on their own server. They're going to have plenty of file space to handle these things. So it really depends on your design of your app. I generally do not put giant chunks of data in databases like this. But if I ran into a situation where it was really necessity, I don't know that I would be completely against it. One general tip, not necessarily Postgres specific, that I would recommend those, if you are putting the giant chunks of things in your database and you're not using a create large object, but maybe you're putting them on a table, I would definitely recommend that you create a separate table for these things and just relate it to whatever table's using it, rather than add it as a column onto another table that already has a bunch of important information. That keeping things isolated might give you better ways to index and overall improve performance, because you don't have to join in that information unless you need it, and the database doesn't even need to think about it. All right, I'm just scanning over here. I think that was the last question in the queue at the moment, so I'm checking my notes. All right, the other thing I wanted to show, we're going to go back to, get a little time here, our first example. And close this, and we'll take a look at creating a second user to log in. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to create a role. And I'll create another user here to connect to that role. We'll do the birthday boy. And I will assign that role. Now there's a new user on the system. Obviously, we want to do this later. All right. So we now have a new user on the system. So I could come back here to the connect button and change the user and run this. Now it won't log in. We should get an error. Sorry, it will log in. What it won't do is show the data. Hopefully that's the error. Yes. And we're getting an error because we haven't assigned any privileges to actually see the data in the database for this particular user. I did add the user to the login role, which was, what I just did here. That's why they could log in. But I didn't give them permissions to see anything. So I can do that by clicking on the particular table in question. Make it a little bigger so I can see all the tabs. But we want the privileges tab. And I can add to the group the select privilege. Now I can go back to my app, which, I guess I quit it. And now that it has select privilege, I'm able to select the data. Now I won't be a good test to click the create or the add at the moment. Actually try the add. I would expect some sort of error. I'm not logging what the error is, but yeah, we didn't add the privilege to be able to insert data into the table. We also didn't add any privileges to be able to create tables. So this can be handy depending on how you're deploying your application and how you want to configure its usage, but that's how multiple users generally operate. All right, the next Xojo example I want to take a look at here, if I can find my Finder window, is our listen and notify examples. And these two little projects allow you to get events and to send events to apps that are connected to the Postgres database. So I'm just going to run both of these projects here. All right, we've got our notify window and our listen window. So we'll connect them up to the database. Now I can click the send notification button. And then you can see a moment later that the listener has received this notification and from the particular ID of, I guess, whoever sent the notification. And you can listen on multiple notifications. I could tell it to start listening on notification 2. And you see it received notification 2. Actually, I believe you can listen on multiple ones. Let's send one back to, yeah, so it received both the notifications. So what are these things handy for? Well, particularly if you've got an app that's used by multiple users, which is, a really great reason to be using a database server like this. There may be situations where you want the app to be notified that some data has changed, for example. So you can use a notifier, a listen and notify setup like this to tell a window to automatically reload, for example. You could use it to send out notifications that say, warning, database server is going down in 5 minutes. And all the clients would get that notification and could, let the user know, gracefully quit, do whatever you want. So a lot of techniques you can use for the notify and listen capability. So let's take a look at what that pretty simple code looks like. The usual connection to the database stuff. And then you call the listen method with the name of the notification. So that means I'm now listening for this notification. And that's it for setting up the notification. On the database itself, you can see there's an event down here. Now this does mean you need to make the event accessible. Often with databases, you may not, I don't think any of the other ones actually have events that you would care about, so you may not need to subclass it or drop it onto a window or something so that the events become available. But When you do that, the same as you would any other class, you now have that receive notification event handler that you can use because it'll supply you with the information that came in. Looking at the notify, again, very similar, same database connection stuff. There's a notify method that you can call, and you specify the notification name. And that's it. Anyone that's connected to that database that is listening for these notifications will get that event that your app can then deal with. So again, a pretty neat thing. This capability is not in the, I don't know if other databases have it, but certainly this is the only way to do this in the databases that are supported by Xojo. Marcus is asking if you get the notifications, if you happen to be offline when a notification is sent, and then you go online, do you see the missed notifications? That's a great question. I have no idea. I haven't tried that. We can try that though. Somehow I'm thinking no, but actually, if we quit the listener and we just do some notifications, and then I run the listener, I'm not going to expect that these things are queued up for it, but we'll see what we get. So it doesn't look like it's putting up any event handler calls related to the earlier notifications. It's only going to be the ones that are sent while it happens to be online. Certainly we can do more testing on that, but it looks like the answer is no. Terry's asking if this listen and notify is unique to Postgres. Well, it's certainly unique to our Postgres plugin that's included with Xojo. I'm not entirely sure if it's unique to Postgres as a database in general. These database servers move often with feature sets and whatnot, and I used Oracle an awful lot back in the day, as in 10 years ago or more, but I'm not super familiar with what its latest versions may have for features. Same you could say with the Microsoft SQL Server. So I don't know if it's completely unique, but it is unique in the world of Xojo anyway. Pat is asking if this listen notification thing works with web apps, and yeah, absolutely. It's part of the database plugin itself, so it would work just fine with web apps. Generally, in a web app, you would be connecting once for each session. You may or may not use different usernames for that. Who knows? Depending again on your design. But you just need to keep a reference to the connection around so that you can get the events. Yeah, and Gerald is noting that, yeah, certainly if you're required to get notifications while you happen to be offline or your app happen to be offline, maybe you would have a different app that remains connected to the database so that it can get the notifications and then tell your app about them when they come online. And for all I know, there might be server settings that do allow these things to be cached and sent out to clients as they connect. Postgres does have many, many configuration settings and options and whatnot, and who knows if there's that setting on there. Cam is asking if there's an easy way to say listen for all notifications. And no, not that I'm aware. You have to do it. Listen for specific named notifications. All right, I'm just checking my notes here again. All right, well, I got one URL here I want to share. This is a list of tools that can be used with Postgres in case you decide that this tool isn't up to your standards. This is from the Postgres wiki. I have not tried really any of these recently. One of note that I did try, Valentina Studio, the people that make the Valentina database, their admin app does connect to Postgres and seems to work, but it doesn't. In my quick testing, it didn't look like it was an admin app, so it connected to a specific database and then let you see the tables and whatnot in the database, but it wouldn't let you. I didn't think it let you manage users and add databases and stuff like that. And of course, there's quite a few other ones that are available that you can try out and see, and including some down in the proprietary section that can start to cost money. In the past, I think I've used Navicat in the past. I haven't used that probably in the last couple of years, but that one is pretty well known and worked well enough when I used it. Cam is also mentioning that Valentina Studio is free, and he thinks it works excellently. Let's see. Carol is asking if there are certain apps where we would prefer using Postgres over other common databases. Well, yeah, that was on my list here. Probably was the next thing I was going to mention. And certainly with other database servers, what would be the advantage of using Postgres over a different database server? Well, the ones that Xojo supports are MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server. And then, of course, you have ODBC to access anything else that you happen to have a driver for. Now, but of the main four that you can connect to using native plugins with Xojo, I prefer Postgres out of all of those. The primary reason would be it is fully cross-platform, but so is MySQL. It's free. None of the others can make that claim as being free and fully cross-platform. MySQL has unusual licensing that tends to make me stay away from it. It is generally free, but there are restrictions around that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that Xojo's MySQL plugin is GPL. So if you do use that in your apps, you're bound by that GPL license, which, depending on how you distribute your app, might be bad for you. So that is something to keep in mind. Oracle is somewhat cross-platform. I believe it runs on Windows and Linux. They used to have an OS X version, but I don't think they do anymore. Oracle did have some free versions last I checked as well, but I don't particularly think that Oracle is a very easy to use database. Probably, of course, back in the day, Postgres wasn't terribly easy to use either. I think Postgres is probably easier to work with than Oracle nowadays. Microsoft SQL Server is very nice. I found it very easy to use, but it is completely Windows specific. And there aren't even any good ways to connect to a MySQL database from OS X or Linux for that matter. I think you can probably do it using a JDBC driver, but that's obviously less than ideal. So that kind of leaves Postgres as the last database standing, if you will. So it ends up being the one that I pick for most situations. Craig is asking if there are any issues using Xojo web apps with Postgres. No issues, none at all. Worked great for that. Highly recommend it for web applications if you have the need to have a more robust database server, or you're dealing with multiple users or all that sort of things that make a database server the way to go. Pat is noting that, and I'll quote him here, Oracle is a nightmare. I can't argue with that. And I'm sure Karsten is noting there's on YouTube there's at least one quick comparison of Oracle and Postgres. But yeah, certainly you can Google around and find not Oracle, but MySQL and Postgres. You can certainly Google around and find thorough comparisons of the various database servers, so you can see what the feature sets are and whatnot. From a more technical standpoint, I would suspect that most people are not going to hit the super technical differences between any of these database servers, such that they'd be like, well, I have to go with a particular MySQL setup with a particular way that the tables are created, so that I get the performance I need for this giant app that I'm building that has millions of users or something like that. Most people don't hit that level of a wall. So any of these databases will be more than sufficient from that standpoint. So then you want to pick the one that you're most comfortable with, that's easy to use, that's not going to impose heavy licensing restrictions on you, that sort of thing. Michael is asking, what are the implications of the GPL? Well, first of all, the Postgres plugin is not GPL. Postgres plugin is open license, same as you would with anything else you build with Xojo. The MySQL plugin is GPL. So the MySQL plugin included with Xojo is GPL. So that means if you use the MySQL plugin in your Xojo app, you're bound by the GPL licensing clause. I'm not about to even begin to go into what the ramifications are, except that they're rarely good. And usually involves that your source has to be made available in some manner or another. There are links to all that on our documentation wiki if you go to the MySQL page. That will send you to the appropriate places. But even then, I haven't found a lot of that stuff to be terribly well explained by Oracle on their website. And yes, MySQL is actually owned by Oracle these days. And Michael is asking, comparing PostgreSQL and Enterprise DB. Well, I don't have much to say about that. I haven't specifically used Enterprise DB. My understanding is that they are simply using Postgres essentially under the hood, if you will, and provide a professional support platform for it, so that enterprise and large companies feel more comfortable going with Postgres. And that's probably one thing you may have seen. I mean, sometimes you don't get to choose your database server. It's chosen for you by either your client or the company you work for or something else. And larger companies that I have worked for are usually tied down to a particular database for a variety of reasons. And I've worked at companies where Oracle's the database you use, and that's all you use, and you don't get to use anything else. And why do they like that? It's because it's crazy expensive, and Postgres would be cheaper. Well, it's because they feel they get all the support they need from a large company like Oracle, so they feel safer with it. And I think that's what Enterprise DB's place in the world is to make Postgres feel safer, so that companies will be confident when they rely on it. Right, as Craig says, or they may have a site license with Oracle because they're a gigantic company, and that actually ends up being more cost effective for them to go that way. They may have a database administration team that is experts in Oracle, and all the database stuff goes through there, and they don't want to deal with issues of maintaining or managing other databases. Lots of things that can come up when you're dealing with database servers and you're working for other people or building software for others. But when I have the choice to choose the database server I want to work with, PostgreSQL is usually at the top of the list for evaluation to go with. All right, I think I've covered everything in my notes here. I'm just going to scan them real quickly since we're almost out of time. Oh, no, one thing I wanted to point out. Just announced in our forum this week is a Xojo user has written a book, PostgreSQL for Xojo. And I haven't had a chance to check out this book. I'll click this table of contents here. See if it loads. I know Eugene has written a variety of these type of how do I do something books for Xojo. So this might be something to grab. Looks like he's covered quite a bit here. Certainly a large page count, almost 400 pages. So there you go. I'll end with that note that we do have a Xojo user creating a book that will probably be useful to many people. So certainly if you have questions on this or databases in general, I'm happy to hear from people. You can always reach me at paul@xojo.com. Forums are a great place to ask database related questions. I did see shortly before the webinar that Pat had asked a question about stored procedure usage with PostgreSQL, which I thought was a fascinating question, but he asked it too close to the webinar for me to have done enough research to be able to answer it here, but I'll probably look at that later this afternoon. But you get lots of people there that use a wide variety of databases, and you'll probably run into someone who has tried what you've done already. So that's it for today. I want to thank everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day.